Welcome back to Educator.com, Intermediate C++. Today we will be talking about macros and a little bit about compilations. And this, believe it or not, is an ampersand. Fancy font. Whee! Okay, so we have preprocessor macros. This is another feature from C, and if you use it properly, it's an extremely useful feature in C++. Now you've already seen that. You've seen the pound include directive that retrieves other files, particularly header files, brings them in your files, and you might think, oh, that's a C++ thing. No. Well, it's a C thing. No, it's a C preprocessor thing. When you see the pound sign in the first character of the line and then a directive after that, then that is a preprocessor. The C++ compiler, with few exceptions, never sees any code like this. So one of the directives is define, which is used to set constants. And it's one of the things that was a very common way of setting things in C, where you'd have a list of variables. Pi equals 3.14. So you'd have a define, you'd have pi, then you'd have 3.14 or 15 or whatever you wanted it to be. And then you'd have all your various constants would be defined this way. Now in C++, you would use a constant instead, because that way you get a type. You'd say const double, and then pi, and then equals whatever it's equal to. So it's usually better in most cases with many of the macros that are available to you. You're better off to use a C++ language feature. There are occasions when you can't, but when you can, you should use them. We can have conditional compilation that can make huge sections of code just completely disappear. The compiler will never see them, basically because the preprocessor will remove them before giving them to the compiler. And we'll also cover a little bit of command line compiling, where you can put different options on the command line when you compile your code. Particularly, it's important stuff. You can pass in a macro on the command line, which you can then process with the preprocessor to, for example, take entire sections of code and make them go away. So we'll have flags that allow the compiler to find files that it can use to compile with, which, for example, to get an include directive. When you say include, you need to tell the compiler, where am I going to get that file to be included into this file? And we can facilitate debugging, where we can print out certain information and set values for the preprocessor macros. So I say it's another feature left over from C. It has some of the same dangers that it had with C. Those dangers are still there. C++ has replaced many of those dangers with a language safe feature, but some areas are still dependent on the preprocessor macros. You define it by having a pound or a hash sign or whatever you want to call it. Checkerboard, I've heard it said. Hash mark in the first column, followed by your macro keyword, whatever it is, define, if, def, etc., followed by the macro name, if there is one that goes with it, and then its definition. The definition goes from there. When you have a define, it goes from the define keyword to the end of the line, which we'll talk about more later because it's very important. The macros are pre-processed on a textual basis. The C++ compiler has no idea about the type of what's being going with. That's where your dangers come in. And there's no regard to the C++ language, C or C++. You can do all, because basically it's a text replacement. You're saying define this to be that. So everywhere inside the code where this shows up, the preprocessors will, oh, that's one of my things that were defined. Just throw that out and put the replacement there instead. So the compiler has absolutely no way to check for types, syntax, ranges, anything else that you would want the compiler to test for you. When you use a preprocessor macro, you throw all of that out the window. So you throw it out the window with caution, with care. Now, like I said, many legacy uses, you don't need the macro anymore. You don't need to use define to make a pi, to make it equal to a certain number. You can now use a language feature, constant And that way you can give it a type and set it equal to what. And this is important because you may not need a double, for example. You may only need it to be float, and the compiler might upgrade it might promote it to a double. Anyhow, the compiler can do type checking if you use the C++ features instead of the preprocessor macros.